Democrats who seems to be on the fence, freshman Congressman Hakeem Jeffries from New York. Thanks for being here.
Thank you for having me.
Congressman, tell us, what are the factors that would get you to a yes vote on this Syrian intervention?
Well, first, it is important to note that I do strongly believe, based on the evidence that has been presented, that it's reasonably likely that a chemical weapons attack was carried out by the Syrian government with Assad's knowledge against innocent civilians, and that's something that cannot be countenanced. It's also a clear violation of international law. That leads us to the question as to what is the appropriate level of response and sanction to deal with the chemical weapons attack, which we should not tolerate anywhere on this globe. What's unclear to me is that a targeted military strike is the appropriate response, particularly in a region that's incredibly volatile, given what we've seen in Iraq and Afghanistan, and the reasonable fears that many of my constituents have articulated that any military strike could escalate to a full-on conflict, and that's something that I think most people in this country aren't prepared to embrace.
So, Congressman, when you look at it that way, then, does that mean your main concern is it's spilling into a wider war or having a lack of stability on the chemical weapons that are inside the country, and that could invite the U.S. into the wider conflict with a larger operation or ground troops? Is that what's giving you pause at this point?
Well, that certainly is one of the reasons why I'm carefully considering what should be done here, but want to proceed with all deliberate speed, to borrow another phrase that was used in a different context. We know that there are bad actors on both sides, unfortunately. Syria is a bad actor. Its allies are Hezbollah and Iran. They're going to threaten, and we've got to protect the interests of our allies in the region, Turkey, Jordan, Israel. But we've also had bad actors on the other side, Al-Qaeda. And we're not clear what the level of organization is in terms of the opposition and the moderate forces within the opposition and their opportunity to prevail. If we do weaken the Assad regime and it collapses, the question then becomes what comes next, and is there a stable environment? We've seen the consequences of a dictator falling over in Egypt with all of the expectations that things would get better, democracy would flourish, but in that region it's not that clean. And so there's a reasonable concern that if you further destabilize things in Syria, things could get worse, not better, and that could lead to further destabilization in the region and possible escalation involving U.S. troops. And again, that's something that we have to be very wary about.
Congressman, a lot of folks are looking to the Congressional Black Caucus as a key voting bloc on this issue. What are you hearing from your colleagues there?
Well, many of us throughout the country are taking account of what our constituents have to say. And we should also note that it's important to put this in the context of what's happened during the last 10 years, where you had a debacle in Iraq, a failed effort in Afghanistan, though perhaps initially justified, and the incredible diversion of resources away from domestic priorities, where we have communities that are still suffering with incredible unemployment, poverty, income disparities, and issues that need to be addressed here at home. So I know all of my colleagues, not just members of the Congressional Black Caucus, although we may be particularly sensitive to the issue of getting involved in a foreign conflict that will further divert resources away from the issues that we need to be dealing with here at home for the people that we represent.
You talk about the people that you represent. You got folks all over the country calling their congresspeople to say, hey, I don't want an intervention here. Well, hate to get all ask your congressman on you, but I am in your district. I am one of your constituents. I live in Fort Greene. So let's get all ask your congressman about it. Let's get local. How would a strike impact the people of Brooklyn? How would it impact the people in your district?
Well, aside from the risk of escalation that could turn into an open-ended conflict that then requires substantial amount of resources being diverted away from domestic issues, or increased debt that we'd have to acquire in the United States, which complicates a whole host of issues. There's the human cost that I think is disproportionately borne by neighborhoods like those that I represent, which send a significant amount of people into the military and therefore into conflicts like Iraq and Afghanistan and any other future conflicts that we may have to get involved in the Middle East. And so that human cost is also something that weighs heavily on me, that I know that a vote for a military strike which under the wrong circumstances could lead to an escalated conflict, might ultimately result in young men and women from the neighborhoods that I represent being put into harm's way. And that is also why this is a very solemn moment for all of us in the Congress, and I'm taking it with all the seriousness that it deserves.
Well, and Congressman, the majority of Americans are still skeptical. They are not convinced. It's interesting. I looked at a poll that took place in December. 63% of Americans were actually supportive of U.S. action if Syria used chemical weapons. At that point, it was a hypothetical question, a stark contrast, obviously, to what we're seeing today, about 60% opposing a missile strike. And many of these people are waiting to hear from the president. They want the president to lay out his case. When do you expect to hear from President Obama, and what could he say to change public perception?
Well, I support the president. I trust the president, and I do think that his credibility is very different than that of the Bush-Cheney crowd and the shenanigans that we saw, which led us into the war in Iraq. The problem, of course, that this president confronts is that he's saddled with those credibility issues, perhaps unfairly, as a result of what was done in the past and what led us into the conflict in Iraq. I do think that for that reason, it is very important for the president, in a clear-throated way, in a manner that he's able to communicate, given the information, some of which is classified, but some of which hopefully can be directly told to the American people as to the compelling reasons for the United States to act, why a failure to act will make the situation worse, not better. And if he can persuasively make that case to the American people, then perhaps he can turn public opinion around.
And Congressman, before we let you go, are you leaning yes or no?
Well, I wouldn't say that I'm leaning yes or no, but I do have a healthy degree of skepticism as it relates to voting for anything that could lead to an escalation that could put the people in my district into harm's way.
All right. Well, thanks for sharing your views.